The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty training ground at Fort Bragg. Sarah Chen adjusted her rifle scope for the third time, trying to ignore the snickers from the group of male soldiers standing behind her. At 22, she was one of only 12 women in the elite sniper training program, and the doubt in her instructor's eyes was as clear as the North Carolina sky above them. "Think she'll even hit the target board?" whispered Sergeant Martinez to his buddy. They weren't trying to be quiet. Sarah had heard it all before. Too small, too soft, too emotional. The same words that had followed her through basic training, through advanced marksmanship, and now through the most demanding precision shooting course the Army offered. At 5 feet 4 inches and weighing barely 130 pounds, she looked nothing like the typical sniper candidate. Her slight frame seemed almost fragile next to the towering figures of her male counterparts, most of whom had grown up hunting and handling firearms since childhood. But what they couldn't see was the fire that burned inside her chest, the determination that had carried her from a small apartment in San Francisco's Chinatown to this elite training program. Her parents had immigrated from Taiwan with nothing but hope and the belief that in America, anyone could become anything they worked hard enough to achieve. They never imagined their daughter would choose to become a soldier, much less a sniper. Master Sergeant Jake Morrison stepped up to the firing line, his weathered face showing no emotion. At 45, he had trained hundreds of snipers over his 20-year career, most washed out within the first 2 weeks. Looking at Chen, he had his doubts she'd make it through the first week. "All right, Chen," Morrison called out, his voice carrying across the range. "Today we're starting with basic precision shooting. Target is at 800 yards. You've got 3 shots to prove you belong here." 800 yards. For most people, that distance would make a human target invisible to the naked eye. Through a rifle scope, it was still challenging enough to separate the truly gifted from those who were just good shots. Sarah had been shooting that distance consistently during her preparation, but never under this kind of pressure, with dozens of eyes watching her every move. She settled into her prone position behind the rifle, a standard M24 sniper weapon system. The weapon felt familiar in her hands now, after months of practice. She'd spent countless hours learning every component, every adjustment, every tiny detail that could affect accuracy. While other trainees went out drinking on weekends, she stayed on the range, burning through ammunition and building the muscle memory that separated good shooters from great ones. The wind was slight, maybe 3 miles per hour from the east. Sarah made a minor adjustment to her scope, accounting for the minimal drift. She controlled her breathing, slowing her heart rate with techniques she'd learned from meditation practices her grandmother had taught her as a child. In the scope, the target looked like a small white circle against the brown backdrop of the range. "Any day now, Chen," Morrison said dryly. Sarah ignored him. She'd learned long ago that the only way to prove herself was through performance, not words. Her finger found the trigger, and she began the slow, steady pressure that would send the bullet downrange. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, but she was already tracking through the scope to see where the shot landed. "Hit," came the call from the spotter downrange. "Dead center." A murmur went through the group behind her. One good shot could be luck. Sarah cycled the bolt smoothly, chambering her second round. This time she adjusted for a slight shift in wind direction. Another controlled breath, another steady trigger pull. The second shot landed within inches of the first. "Hit center mass," called the spotter again. The murmuring stopped. Even Morrison raised an eyebrow. For her third shot, Sarah noticed the wind had picked up just slightly. She made a small adjustment and settled in again. This time, the pressure felt different. She knew everyone was watching now, waiting to see if the first 2 shots had been flukes. The weight of expectation sat on her shoulders, but instead of crushing her, it felt familiar. She'd carried expectations her whole life. The third shot broke clean, and through her scope, Sarah watched the bullet impact exactly where she'd aimed. 3 shots, 3 hits, all within a 2-inch group at 800 yards. "Well, I'll be damned," Morrison muttered under his breath. In 20 years of training snipers, he'd seen maybe 5 recruits shoot that well on their first day. The training only got harder from there. Over the following weeks, they moved to longer distances, more challenging conditions, and complex scenarios that tested not just shooting ability but mental toughness. Sarah excelled at the academics too, studying ballistics, weather effects, and range estimation with the same intensity she brought to the practical shooting. But it was during the stalking exercises that she truly began to stand out. The ability to move unseen across terrain, to become invisible even when enemy forces were actively searching, was perhaps the most crucial skill for a military sniper. Sarah's small size, which had been seen as a disadvantage, became an asset. She could hide in spaces where larger soldiers couldn't fit, move through brush without disturbing it, and remain motionless for hours at a time. During one particularly challenging exercise, trainees had to infiltrate within 200 yards of an observation post manned by instructors with binoculars and thermal scopes. They had 4 hours to get into position and take a simulated shot. Most trainees were spotted within the first hour. Sarah chose a route that took her through a drainage ditch filled with thick brush and muddy water. For 3 hours, she moved inches at a time, sometimes remaining frozen for 20 minutes when instructors swept the area with their optics. By the time she reached her final position, she was covered in mud, soaked through, and had thorns embedded in her uniform. But she was invisible. Through her scope, she could see the instructors clearly, completely unaware of her presence. She took her shot at the precise time required by the exercise parameters, then remained hidden for another hour as instructors searched frantically for her position. When time was called and she finally stood up, she was less than 150 yards from the observation post. "Goddamn ghost," Morrison said when she reported back to the assembly point. It was the first compliment he'd ever given her. Word of Sarah's abilities began to spread beyond the sniper training program. Officers from various units started asking about the small Asian woman who was outperforming veteran soldiers in one of the Army's most demanding courses. Some were impressed, others skeptical, but all were curious. The skepticism only increased when Sarah graduated at the top of her class 6 months later. She'd outshot, outstalked, and outperformed every other trainee in the program, including several who had come from specialized units with years of combat experience. But graduation was just the beginning. Her first assignment was to the 3rd Infantry Division at Fort Stewart, Georgia. The unit was preparing for deployment to Afghanistan, where American forces were engaged in some of the most challenging combat operations of the war. Sarah would be assigned to a reconnaissance platoon, providing precision fire support for troops operating in the mountainous terrain along the Pakistani border. The mountains of Afghanistan were unlike anything she'd trained for. The elevation changed everything about ballistics, making shots that should have been routine into complex calculations involving air density, temperature variations, and wind patterns that could change dramatically with altitude. The enemy was well-trained, well-equipped, and intimately familiar with terrain they'd been fighting in for decades. Sarah's platoon was part of a larger operation designed to establish a permanent observation post on a strategic ridgeline overlooking a valley that insurgents used to move supplies and fighters between Pakistan and Afghanistan. Intelligence indicated the enemy wouldn't give up the position easily, but no one expected the level of resistance they encountered. The convoy came under attack before they even reached the base of the mountain. Improvised explosive devices destroyed 2 vehicles, and small arms fire from concealed positions pinned down the entire unit for hours. When they finally fought their way to the designated area, they found the ridgeline honeycombed with caves, bunkers, and fighting positions that had been prepared over months or years. What was supposed to be a quick operation to establish an observation post turned into a siege that would last 6 months. The American forces managed to take the high ground, but they couldn't push the enemy out of their entrenched positions in the valley below. Resupply became a nightmare, with helicopters taking heavy fire every time they attempted to reach the isolated outpost. Sarah found herself in a war unlike anything she'd imagined. This wasn't the clean, precise shooting of the training range. This was dirty, chaotic, and deadly. Insurgents would pop up from hidden positions, take a few shots, then disappear into the maze of caves and tunnels they'd carved into the mountainside. Traditional military tactics seemed useless against an enemy that refused to fight conventionally. The other soldiers in her unit watched her carefully during those first weeks. Combat would tell them whether their sniper was really as good as her training scores suggested, or if she'd fold under pressure like so many others had. The mountains had a way of exposing weaknesses that no amount of training could hide. Sarah set up her position in a shallow depression near the edge of the ridge, surrounded by rocks that provided both concealment and protection from return fire. From her position, she had a clear view of the valley below, but the distances were extreme. Most of the enemy positions were more than 1,200 yards away, well beyond the range where most snipers could operate effectively. Her first engagement came on the third day of the siege. A group of insurgents was moving through a narrow ravine, apparently unaware they were being observed. Sarah tracked them through her scope, calculating range, wind drift, and elevation adjustments. At 1,400 yards, it was a challenging shot under the best circumstances. In the thin air of the Afghan mountains, with swirling winds and irregular terrain, it bordered on impossible. She waited until the lead insurgent stopped in a small clearing, giving her a stationary target. The shot was true, and the insurgent dropped immediately. The others scattered for cover, but not before Sarah had time for a second shot. Another hit, another confirmed kill. Word spread quickly through both camps. The Americans had a sniper who could reach out and touch targets at extreme range. The insurgents learned to be more careful about exposing themselves, but that only made Sarah's job more challenging and more important. As the weeks turned into months, the siege became a grinding war of attrition. Supplies ran low on both sides, but the Americans were particularly vulnerable because of their isolation on the ridge. Every bullet, every drop of water, every medical supply had to be flown and under fire. The pressure on the unit was immense, and some soldiers began to crack under the strain. Sarah adapted to the conditions with a determination that impressed even the most veteran soldiers in the unit. She learned to read the mountain winds, to account for the extreme elevation, and to make shots that defied conventional ballistics tables. More importantly, she learned to be patient, sometimes waiting hours for a single opportunity to take out a high-value target. But it was her ability to remain calm under pressure that truly set her apart. During one particularly intense firefight, when insurgent mortars were landing within 50 yards of her position and machine gun fire was chipping rocks all around her, Sarah methodically engaged targets as if she were back on the range at Fort Bragg. Other soldiers marveled at her composure, but for Sarah, it was simply a matter of focus. The siege was wearing on everyone, but Sarah knew that the real test was yet to come. Intelligence reports indicated that insurgent leaders were growing frustrated with their inability to dislodge the American forces from the ridge. They were planning something big, something that would either drive the Americans out or destroy them entirely. What Sarah didn't know was that her reputation had spread far beyond the immediate battlefield. Insurgent commanders had put a price on her head, recognizing that the American sniper was having a significant impact on their operations. They were bringing in their own specialists, snipers trained by foreign fighters with years of experience in urban warfare and mountain combat. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would test everything Sarah had learned, everything she believed about herself, and everything the army had taught her about being a soldier. The mountains of Afghanistan were about to become the proving ground for a young woman who had spent her entire military career being underestimated. As she cleaned her rifle one evening, watching the sun set over the valley where enemy forces still held their positions, Sarah thought about the journey that had brought her here. From the streets of San Francisco to the mountains of Afghanistan, she'd always been fighting to prove herself. But now, for the first time, she began to understand that the fight wasn't really about proving anything to others. The fight was about discovering who she really was when everything else was stripped away. The fourth month of the siege brought new challenges that tested every soldier's limits. Winter was approaching in the Afghan mountains, and temperatures dropped below freezing every night. Sarah woke each morning with frost covering her equipment and ice crystals in her water bottles. The cold made everything harder. Weapons malfunctioned more frequently, batteries died faster, and the human body moved slower and less precisely. But the cold was the least of their problems. Intelligence reports indicated that insurgent forces had brought in reinforcements, including several foreign fighters with advanced training in asymmetric warfare. More concerning were reports of a sniper team that had been responsible for American casualties in other sectors. The enemy was no longer content to simply hold their positions in the valley below. Sarah noticed the change in tactics immediately. Where insurgents had previously been careless about exposure, moving in groups and using predictable routes, they now moved with the discipline of trained soldiers. They used cover effectively, varied their patterns, and most importantly, they seemed to understand how American snipers operated. "They're learning," observed Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, the platoon's senior non-commissioned officer. He was studying the valley through his binoculars from a position next to Sarah's hide. "Someone down there knows what they're doing." Sarah nodded, tracking movement through her scope. A group of fighters was moving through a ravine nearly 1,600 yards away, but they were using terrain features and timing their movement to avoid exposure. Professional training was evident in their discipline. "They've got someone teaching them," Sarah said quietly. "Someone who's fought against American snipers before." The proof came 2 days later when Corporal Jimmy Patterson was killed by a single rifle shot while manning an observation post on the eastern edge of the ridge. The shot had come from an impossible angle, suggesting the enemy sniper had infiltrated to within 800 yards of the American position without being detected. More disturbing was the precision of the shot. Patterson had been hit in the head while wearing body armor, indicating an enemy marksman of considerable skill. The psychological impact on the unit was immediate. Soldiers who had grown accustomed to moving freely around their defensive positions now sprinted between bunkers and kept their heads down. The enemy sniper had achieved what months of mortar attacks and machine gun fire had failed to accomplish. He had the Americans looking over their shoulders. Captain James Morrison, the company commander, called a meeting of his senior leaders that evening. The resemblance to Sarah's former instructor was purely coincidental, but both men shared the same no-nonsense approach to solving problems. "We've got an enemy sniper operating somewhere in the valley below," Morrison told the assembled group. "He's good enough to get close, make precision shots, and disappear without being detected. That makes him a priority target." All eyes turned to Sarah. After 4 months of combat, she had established herself as the unit's most effective long-range shooter. Her kill count was approaching 20 confirmed eliminations, and several times her precise fire had broken up enemy attacks before they could develop into serious threats. "Chen, I need you to find this guy and take him out," Morrison continued. "He's got our people scared, and scared soldiers make mistakes. We can't afford mistakes up here." Sarah understood the assignment, but she also understood the challenge. Hunting another sniper was perhaps the most dangerous mission a marksman could undertake. It required patience, skill, and a willingness to take enormous risks. The enemy shooter had already proven his ability by killing Patterson and evading detection afterward. "I'll need to change my position," Sarah said. "If he's as good as he seems, he's probably already figured out where I usually shoot from." Over the next 3 days, Sarah established a new hide site on the north side of the ridge, in a position that offered a different view of the valley. It was a more exposed location, with less natural cover, but it allowed her to observe areas that had been blind spots from her previous position. She also changed her routine completely. Instead of operating during the hours when most military snipers preferred to work, Sarah began conducting surveillance during periods when enemy activity was typically low. If the insurgent sniper was professional enough to study American patterns, she would give him patterns that didn't fit the standard playbook. The waiting began. For hours each day, Sarah lay motionless in her new position, scanning the valley for any sign of the enemy marksman. She studied every rock, every shadow, every possible hide site where a sniper might position himself. The work was exhausting, requiring absolute concentration while fighting off fatigue, cold, and the cramped muscles that came from remaining in one position too long. On the 6th day of her hunt, Sarah noticed something unusual. In a cluster of rocks about 1,200 yards away, she detected a brief glint that didn't match the natural surroundings. It lasted only a fraction of a second, but her trained eye caught it immediately. Sunlight reflecting off glass, possibly a rifle scope or binoculars. She marked the location in her mind and continued her surveillance without changing her position or giving any indication she had spotted anything. If there was an enemy sniper in those rocks, any sudden movement might alert him to her presence. Instead, she waited and watched. 2 hours later, she saw it again, another brief reflection from the same area. This time, she was certain. Someone with optical equipment was positioned in that cluster of rocks, and they were observing the American positions on the ridge. But knowing where the enemy sniper was hiding was only the first step. Sarah needed to positively identify him as a threat and find an opportunity to engage. The distance was manageable. She had made successful shots at longer range, but the target was well concealed and would only be vulnerable for brief moments. Sarah spent the rest of the day studying the enemy position. She noted the angles that would give a shooter clear fields of fire toward the American positions, identified the most likely spots where someone would position themselves within the rock cluster, and calculated the ballistics for a shot at that range and elevation. As darkness fell, she carefully recorded everything she had observed in a notebook that she kept for tactical intelligence. The enemy sniper's position, his probable fields of fire, the timing of his observations, and most importantly, the pattern of his movement. Every sniper had habits, unconscious routines that could be exploited by a patient observer. The next morning, Sarah was back in position before dawn. She had decided to attempt the engagement during the early morning hours when changing light conditions might force the enemy sniper to adjust his position or equipment. If he was using optical devices to observe the American positions, he would need to account for the glare from the rising sun. At 7:15 a.m., she saw him, a figure moving within the rock cluster, silhouetted briefly against the lighter stone as he shifted position. Through her scope, she could see he was carrying a rifle and appeared to be wearing the same type of camouflage clothing used by insurgent forces in the area. Sarah tracked the movement, leading slightly to account for the target's motion. The range was 1,247 yards according to her laser rangefinder. Wind was minimal, maybe 2 miles per hour from the west. Elevation difference was approximately 200 feet, requiring her to aim slightly low to compensate for the downward angle. She controlled her breathing and settled into the shot. This was the moment she had trained for, prepared for, and thought about for days. Everything depended on precision, timing, and the ability to remain calm under pressure that was more intense than anything she had experienced. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, and Sarah immediately tracked through her scope to observe the impact. At that distance, it took nearly 2 seconds for the bullet to reach the target. She watched the insurgent sniper suddenly stiffen, then collapse behind the rocks that had concealed him. "Target down," she whispered into her radio. But Sarah's job wasn't finished. She needed to confirm the kill and ensure that there were no other enemy snipers in the area. For the next hour, she maintained surveillance of the enemy position, watching for any sign of movement or for other insurgents who might attempt to recover their fallen comrade. When enemy fighters finally approached the position 2 hours later, their body language told the story. They moved with the urgency of people attempting to recover casualties, and their evident distress confirmed that Sarah's shot had found its mark. Word of the successful engagement spread quickly through the unit. Soldiers who had been moving nervously between positions for days began to relax slightly. The immediate threat had been eliminated, though everyone understood that other enemy snipers might be operating in the area. Captain Morrison visited Sarah's position that afternoon to personally congratulate her on the successful mission. "Outstanding work, Chen," he said. "That son of a bitch was making life difficult for everyone up here." But Sarah's success against the enemy sniper had an unintended consequence. Intelligence intercepts over the following days indicated that insurgent leaders were increasingly frustrated with the continued American presence on the ridge. The loss of their skilled marksmen, combined with the ongoing casualties from Sarah's precise fire, had led them to authorize more aggressive measures. They were planning a major assault designed to overrun the American positions entirely. Unlike previous attacks that had been probing actions or harassment, this would be a coordinated assault by several hundred fighters, including suicide bombers and heavy weapons teams. The Americans had approximately 1 week to prepare for an attack that could determine the outcome of the entire 6-month siege. Sarah realized that her individual skills, while important, would be tested as part of a larger battle that would require everything the unit had learned about working together under extreme pressure. As she prepared her equipment and adjusted her positions to provide the best possible fields of fire for the coming battle, Sarah thought about how much she had changed since arriving in Afghanistan. The doubts that had plagued her during training seemed distant now, replaced by a quiet confidence that came from proven performance under the most challenging conditions imaginable. But she also understood that the real test was still ahead. Everything that had happened over the past 4 months had been preparation for the battle that was coming. The enemy was bringing everything they had, and the Americans would need to be perfect to survive what intelligence sources were calling the largest insurgent assault in this sector since the war began. Sarah cleaned her rifle methodically, checking every component and preparing extra ammunition for the engagement ahead. She had proven herself against individual targets at extreme range, but the coming battle would require her to engage multiple targets rapidly while under intense fire from enemies who had spent months studying American positions and tactics. The mountains were about to become the stage for a battle that would test not just Sarah's marksmanship skills, but her courage, her endurance, and her ability to perform under pressure that would break most people. Everything she had worked for, everything she had learned, and everything she believed about herself would be decided in the space of a few hours. As night fell over the Afghan mountains, Sarah looked out over the valley where enemy forces were gathering for their assault. Tomorrow would bring the fight of her life, and she intended to be ready for it. The attack began before dawn on a Tuesday morning in late October. Sarah was already in position when the first mortar rounds started falling on the American defensive perimeter. The insurgents had learned from their previous failures and were using coordinated indirect fire to suppress defensive positions while assault teams moved closer under cover of darkness. Through her night vision scope, Sarah could see multiple groups of fighters moving up the mountainside toward the American positions. They were using routes that had been carefully planned to exploit dead space in the defensive coverage, approaching from angles that made it difficult for the Americans to bring effective fire to bear. The assault was unlike anything the insurgents had attempted during the previous 4 months. Instead of the small-scale probing attacks and harassment that had characterized the siege, this was a coordinated assault by an estimated 300 fighters, supported by heavy weapons and what appeared to be professional military leadership. Sarah's radio crackled with reports from observation posts around the perimeter. Contact, contact, multiple enemy forces moving from the south. Estimate 40 to 50 fighters. Mortar fire incoming from the northwest, taking casualties at checkpoint 3. Heavy machine gun fire from the valley floor. Request immediate suppression. The cacophony of battle was overwhelming, but Sarah forced herself to focus on her assigned sector of fire. Through her scope, she could see insurgent fighters moving in disciplined formations, using cover and concealment techniques that suggested extensive training. These weren't the same fighters who had been conducting hit-and-run attacks for months. Her first target appeared at 1,100 yards, a fighter carrying what appeared to be a rocket-propelled grenade launcher. He was moving quickly between rock formations, but Sarah tracked his movement and led the target appropriately. The shot was clean, and the insurgent dropped immediately, his weapon clattering down the rocky slope. But there was no time to dwell on individual successes. More targets were appearing faster than Sarah could engage them. She shifted to a rapid engagement technique, taking quick but precise shots at the most threatening targets while maintaining situational awareness of the overall battle. A mortar round exploded 30 yards from her position, showering her hide sight with rocks and debris. The concussion left her ears ringing, but she stayed focused on her mission. Through her scope, she could see insurgent spotters directing the mortar fire from concealed positions in the valley below. Sarah engaged the spotters methodically, even as explosions continued to rock the ridge around her. Each successful shot disrupted the enemy's ability to coordinate their indirect fire, but new spotters seemed to appear as quickly as the old ones were eliminated. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez's voice came through her radio headset. "Chen, we've got suicide bombers moving toward the main gate. Can you see them from your position?" Sarah shifted her scope toward the eastern approach to the American perimeter. Through the early morning haze, she could see 2 figures in bulky clothing moving deliberately toward the defensive wire. Their body language and the way other insurgents were giving them space confirmed Rodriguez's assessment. The range was extreme, nearly 1,800 yards, and the targets were moving. Sarah had never attempted a shot at that distance under combat conditions, but she understood that the suicide bombers represented a critical threat to the entire defensive position. If they reached the perimeter wire, they could breach the defenses and allow the assault teams to pour through. She calculated the ballistics quickly, accounting for the extreme range, the mountain air density, and the slight crosswind that had picked up with the dawn. The first suicide bomber had stopped behind a large rock, apparently waiting for a signal to make his final approach. Sarah settled into the shot with the methodical precision that had become second nature. At 1,800 yards, the target looked impossibly small through her scope, a human figure reduced to little more than a dark spot against the rocky terrain. But she had made shots at this range before, and the principles remained the same regardless of the pressure. The rifle recoiled, and Sarah tracked through her scope to observe the impact. Nearly 3 seconds later, she saw the first suicide bomber suddenly stumble and fall. The explosion that followed confirmed her suspicions about his intentions, as the bombs he was carrying detonated prematurely. The second bomber, seeing his companion's fate, began running toward the American positions. Sarah cycled her bolt and engaged again, leading the moving target by several feet to account for his speed and the extreme range. The shot was true, dropping the second bomber before he could reach the defensive perimeter. "Outstanding shooting, Chen," Rodriguez's voice was filled with relief. "You just saved our asses." But the battle was far from over. The elimination of the suicide bombers had disrupted the insurgents' planned breach of the American perimeter, but assault teams were still moving up the mountainside from multiple directions. The Americans were vastly outnumbered and would need to rely on superior training, equipment, and tactics to survive the coordinated attack. Sarah continued engaging targets of opportunity, prioritizing leaders, heavy weapons teams, and anyone who appeared to be directing the assault. Her ammunition expenditure was carefully controlled. At this rate of fire, she would exhaust her supply within hours if the battle continued. Around mid-morning, the character of the assault began to change. Instead of the coordinated attack that had begun at dawn, insurgent forces seemed to be falling back on less sophisticated tactics. The elimination of key leaders and communications personnel had disrupted their command and control, reducing the assault to a series of uncoordinated attacks by smaller groups. Sarah noticed that enemy fire was becoming less accurate and less concentrated. The psychological impact of losing leaders and specialists to precision fire was affecting morale among the remaining fighters. Many seemed reluctant to expose themselves, knowing that American snipers were actively hunting for targets. But just as the Americans began to think they might weather the assault, a new threat emerged. Intelligence reports indicated that insurgent forces were moving a large-caliber recoilless rifle into position in the valley below. The weapon was capable of destroying the American bunkers and defensive positions with direct fire, potentially turning the tide of the battle. The recoilless rifle position was at the extreme edge of Sarah's effective range, nearly 2,000 yards away and partially concealed behind a ridge line that made target identification difficult. Engaging at that distance would require perfect conditions and flawless execution. Through her scope, Sarah could see activity around the suspected weapon position, but the insurgents were being careful to avoid exposure. They had apparently learned from earlier casualties and were using disciplined techniques to conceal their preparations. Captain Morrison's voice came through the radio net. "All sniper teams, priority target in the valley below. Grid reference follows. Large caliber weapon that poses immediate threat to defensive positions." Sarah studied the indicated area through her scope. The range was at the very limit of her weapon system's effectiveness, and atmospheric conditions were becoming more challenging as the mountain winds picked up with the warming air. Additionally, she would be shooting at a target that was partially concealed and might only be visible for brief moments. She spent several minutes studying the target area, looking for patterns in the enemy movement, and trying to identify the exact position of the weapon. Finally, she saw what she was looking for: the distinctive silhouette of a recoilless rifle barrel being moved into position by a crew of insurgent fighters. The shot would require everything she had learned about long-range precision fire. The mathematics were complex. Bullet drop at 2,000 yards was measured in dozens of feet. Wind drift could push the projectile several yards off target, and the time of flight was long enough for a moving target to change position significantly. Sarah made her calculations and prepared for what might be the most challenging shot of her military career. The target was stationary for the moment, but that could change at any time. She would have one opportunity to disable the weapon before it could engage American positions. She controlled her breathing and settled into the shot with the same methodical approach she used for all her engagements. At 2,000 yards, the target was barely visible through her scope, but she had confidence in her equipment and her training. The principles of marksmanship remained the same regardless of the distance. The shot broke clean, and Sarah immediately began tracking through her scope to observe the impact. At that extreme range, the time of flight was nearly 4 seconds. She watched the target area intently, looking for any indication that her bullet had found its mark. The explosion was visible even at 2,000 yards. The recoilless rifle's ammunition had apparently been struck by Sarah's bullet, causing a secondary explosion that destroyed the weapon and killed several members of its crew. The threat to the American defensive positions had been eliminated with a single precision shot. "Holy shit, Chen!" Rodriguez's voice was filled with amazement. "Did you just hit something at 2 clicks?" Sarah was already scanning for new targets, but the successful engagement of the recoilless rifle seemed to have broken the insurgent assault. Groups of fighters were withdrawing from their advanced positions, apparently concluding that continued attacks would be too costly given the American defensive capabilities. By afternoon, the battle had devolved into sporadic sniper fire and occasional mortar attacks. The coordinated assault that had threatened to overrun the American positions had been defeated, largely through the efforts of individual soldiers who had performed their duties with exceptional skill under extreme pressure. Sarah remained in position throughout the day, continuing to engage targets of opportunity and provide overwatch for American forces moving around the defensive perimeter. Her ammunition expenditure had been enormous. She had fired more rounds in one day than in the previous 2 months combined, but the results spoke for themselves. As evening approached and the immediate threat seemed to have passed, Sarah began to reflect on the day's events. She had made some of the longest successful engagements of her career, including the 2,000-yard shot that had eliminated the recoilless rifle. More importantly, she had performed under pressure that would have overwhelmed most soldiers. But she also understood that the battle had been won by teamwork, not individual heroics. Every soldier on the ridge had contributed to the successful defense, from the machine gunners who had broken up assault formations to the medics who had kept wounded soldiers fighting. Her precision fire had been important, but it was only one element of a comprehensive defensive effort. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez visited her position as darkness fell. "Outstanding work today, Chen. Command wants a full debrief on your engagements, especially that long-range shot on the recoilless rifle." Sarah nodded, already thinking about the lessons learned and the improvements that could be made for future operations. The insurgent assault had been defeated, but both sides had learned from the engagement. The next battle would likely feature new tactics and different challenges. As she cleaned her rifle and prepared her equipment for another night of vigilance, Sarah realized that something fundamental had changed. The doubts and uncertainties that had plagued her early military career were gone, replaced by quiet confidence born from repeated success under the most challenging conditions imaginable. But more importantly, she had discovered something about herself that no amount of training could have taught. When everything else was stripped away, comfort, safety, certainty about the outcome, she had the ability to remain focused on her mission and perform at the highest level. The siege was not over. Intelligence reports suggested that insurgent forces were regrouping and planning new attacks. But Sarah knew that whatever came next, she would be ready for it. The mountains of Afghanistan had become her proving ground, and she had proven herself worthy of the challenge. 3 weeks after the failed assault, the siege had settled into a deadly game of patience. Both sides had learned hard lessons from the October battle, and the tactics on both sides evolved accordingly. The insurgents had abandoned their attempts at direct assault, instead focusing on a campaign of psychological warfare designed to wear down American morale through constant, low-level harassment. Sarah adapted her techniques to counter the new threat. Instead of the rapid target engagement that had characterized the major battle, she returned to the careful, methodical hunting that had defined her early months in the mountains. But now her reputation preceded her, and insurgent fighters had learned to fear the American sniper who could reach out and kill at distances they had thought impossible. The psychological impact of her long-range shooting was becoming as important as the tactical results. Intercepted communications indicated that insurgent leaders were struggling to maintain morale among fighters who knew that exposure meant potential death from an invisible enemy. Some groups had reportedly refused missions that required movement in areas where Sarah was known to operate. But the isolation and constant pressure were taking their toll on the American forces as well. Resupply missions remained dangerous and irregular, medical evacuation was nearly impossible, and the soldiers on the ridge were beginning to show signs of combat stress that concerned their leaders. Lieutenant Colonel Anderson, the battalion commander, flew in during a brief break in the weather to assess the situation personally. After consulting with Captain Morrison and his senior leaders, Anderson made a decision that would change the course of the siege. "We're going to end this," he told the assembled leadership. "Intelligence has identified the insurgent command structure in this sector, and we have an opportunity to decapitate their leadership with precision operations." The plan was ambitious and risky. American Special Operations Forces would conduct a raid on a compound approximately 15 kilometers away, where insurgent leaders were believed to be meeting. But the compound was heavily defended and located in terrain that made conventional assault extremely difficult. Sarah's role in the operation would be to provide precision fire support from an advanced position that would allow her to engage high-value targets during the raid. The mission would require her to operate alone, nearly 2 miles from the nearest friendly forces, in an area where insurgent patrols were known to be active. The shooting position had been identified through careful analysis of satellite imagery and terrain studies. It was a rocky outcrop that would provide concealment and clear fields of fire toward the target compound, but it was also exposed and would be difficult to defend if Sarah's position was discovered. "This is voluntary, Chen," Captain Morrison told her during the mission briefing. "The risk level is extreme, and if things go wrong, we might not be able to extract you." Sarah studied the satellite photos and tactical overlays, calculating distances and evaluating the technical challenges of the mission. The longest shots would be at ranges approaching 2,500 yards, beyond what most military snipers would consider feasible. But she had proven herself capable of extreme-range engagements, and the intelligence value of eliminating insurgent leaders was enormous. "I can make the shots, sir," she said quietly. "When do we leave?" The infiltration began at 2 a.m. on a moonless night in November. Sarah moved alone through terrain that was familiar to her after months of observation, but traveling at night through enemy-controlled territory required skills that went far beyond marksmanship. She had to navigate by compass and memory, avoid insurgent sentries, and reach her position without being detected. The route to the shooting position took her through a maze of ravines and ridgelines that provided concealment but made navigation extremely challenging. Several times, she had to alter her planned route to avoid enemy positions that intelligence had not identified. The 2-mile journey took nearly 4 hours, but she reached the designated position undetected. The rocky outcrop was everything the intelligence reports had promised. It offered excellent concealment and clear fields of fire toward the target compound, which was visible as a cluster of buildings in a valley below. The range to the nearest building was 2,400 yards, while the farthest structures were nearly 3,000 yards away. Sarah established her hide site carefully, arranging rocks and natural materials to break up the outline of her position and eliminate any chance of detection from below. She had brought extra ammunition, water for 2 days, and communication equipment that would allow her to coordinate with the assault teams. As dawn broke, she began her surveillance of the target area. Through her scope, she could see normal daily activity around the compound, guards walking patrol routes, vehicles moving between buildings, and civilians conducting routine tasks. But intelligence reports indicated that the leadership meeting would not begin until evening, when the principals felt safe from American surveillance. The waiting was perhaps the most challenging aspect of the mission. Sarah had to remain motionless in her position for hours while maintaining alertness and preparing for the precision shooting that would be required when the assault began. The temperature was below freezing, and the wind was strong enough to affect bullet trajectory at extreme range. At 4 p.m., her radio crackled with a code word indicating that the assault teams were in position and the operation was about to begin. Sarah made final adjustments to her scope and confirmed her range estimates to various points around the compound. Everything now depended on timing, precision, and the ability to make shots that pushed the boundaries of what was technically possible. "Sniper, this is Hammer 6, came the voice of the assault team leader. "We have eyes on multiple high-value targets in the main building. Can you confirm range and readiness?" Sarah studied the main building through her scope. At 2,450 yards, it was at the extreme edge of effective range for her weapon system, but she had made successful shots at similar distances during the October battle. More challenging was the wind, which was gusting unpredictably through the valley. "Hammer 6, this is Sniper," she replied. "Range 2,450 yards to main building. Wind is variable, gusting 8 to 12 miles per hour from the southwest. I can engage targets of opportunity when you initiate. The assault began with a coordinated attack on the compound's outer defenses. Explosions echoed through the valley as the special operations teams breached the perimeter and began clearing buildings methodically. Through her scope, Sarah could see insurgent fighters running between structures, trying to establish defensive positions. Her first target was a guard who had taken position on the roof of the main building with a rocket-propelled grenade launcher. The range was 2,475 yards, and the target was partially concealed behind a low wall. Sarah calculated the ballistics for the extreme range shot, accounting for the bullet drop and wind drift that would affect the projectile during its nearly 5-second flight time. The shot broke clean, and Sarah tracked through her scope to observe the impact. The insurgent fighter suddenly staggered and fell, his weapon tumbling from the roof to the courtyard below. At that extreme range, the sound of Sarah's rifle would not reach the compound for several seconds, giving her the opportunity for additional shots before the enemy realized they were under sniper fire. Her second target was a man in civilian clothing who appeared to be directing the compound's defense from a doorway in the main building. Intelligence reports had indicated that insurgent leaders would be dressed as civilians to avoid identification, and this individual's behavior suggested he was a person of importance. The second shot was even more challenging because the target was partially concealed and moving periodically between cover positions. Sarah waited patiently for the right moment, then engaged when the target exposed himself to observe the ongoing assault. The bullet found its mark, and the insurgent leader dropped immediately. But the extreme range shooting had been noticed by defenders in the compound, and they began directing suppressive fire toward the rocky ridgeline where Sarah was positioned. Machine gun bullets ricocheted off rocks around her hide site, and mortar rounds began falling on the slope below her position. Sarah ignored the incoming fire and continued engaging targets of opportunity. Her next shot eliminated a heavy machine gun crew that was engaging the assault teams from a fortified position. The precision fire was having a decisive impact on the battle, neutralizing key defensive positions and eliminating leadership personnel who were trying to coordinate resistance. "Sniper, this is Hammer 6, came the radio call. "Outstanding shooting. You're breaking up their defense beautifully. Can you engage the building on the north side of the compound?" Sarah shifted her scope to the indicated building, which was at the extreme edge of her engagement range. At nearly 2,800 yards, it would be one of the longest successful sniper shots in military history if she could make the hit. But she could see armed figures moving around the structure, and the assault teams needed suppressive fire to complete their mission. She calculated the ballistics for the extreme range shot, making adjustments for the increased bullet drop and wind drift that would affect accuracy at such distance. The mathematics were complex, involving factors that most snipers never had to consider. But Sarah had always excelled at the academic aspects of marksmanship, and she understood the physics involved in extreme-range shooting. The target she selected was an insurgent fighter who had taken position behind a low wall with what appeared to be an anti-tank weapon. The threat he posed to the assault teams was significant, but engaging him at 2,800 yards would require perfect execution under combat conditions. Sarah settled into the shot with the same methodical approach she used for all her engagements, regardless of range. The target looked impossibly small through her scope, reduced to little more than a dark speck against the compound buildings, but she had confidence in her equipment and her training. The shot broke clean, and Sarah began the long wait to observe the impact. At 2,800 yards, the bullet would take nearly 6 seconds to reach the target, time enough for significant changes in wind conditions that could affect the trajectory. She tracked through her scope, watching for any indication that her bullet had found its mark. The insurgent fighter suddenly collapsed behind his position, and the anti-tank weapon he had been preparing to fire remained silent. Sarah's shot had connected at a range that pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible with standard military equipment. "Jesus Christ, sniper," came the awed voice of the assault team leader. "Did you just hit something at nearly 3 kilometers?" But there was no time to celebrate individual achievements. The assault teams were advancing through the compound, clearing buildings and capturing intelligence materials that would provide valuable information about insurgent operations throughout the region. Sarah's mission was to continue providing precision fire support until the operation was complete. Over the next hour, she engaged multiple targets at various ranges, systematically eliminating defensive positions and key personnel who were trying to coordinate resistance to the assault. Her ammunition expenditure was carefully controlled, but she fired more rounds at extreme range during this single operation than most military snipers would fire in an entire deployment. By evening, the assault teams had secured the compound and captured significant intelligence materials, including documents that revealed the structure of insurgent operations throughout the province. More importantly, they had eliminated or captured most of the leadership personnel who had been coordinating attacks against American forces. The extraction phase of the mission was as dangerous as the infiltration had been. Sarah had to move from her exposed position back to friendly lines, while insurgent forces in the area were fully alerted and actively searching for the source of the precision fire that had devastated their leadership. She moved carefully through the same ravines and ridgelines she had used during her approach, but now the terrain was alive with enemy patrols seeking to intercept her withdrawal. Several times, she had to remain motionless for extended periods while insurgent fighters passed within yards of her position. The 2-mile journey back to friendly lines took 6 hours, but Sarah reached the American perimeter undetected just as dawn was breaking. She had successfully completed one of the most challenging sniper missions in military history, making successful engagements at ranges that redefined what was considered possible for precision rifle fire. The intelligence gathered during the raid proved to be extremely valuable, leading to follow-up operations that disrupted insurgent networks throughout the region. More importantly for the immediate situation, the elimination of key leadership personnel had a decisive impact on enemy morale and operational capability. Within days, the siege that had lasted 6 months was effectively over. Insurgent forces withdrew from their positions in the valley, unable to maintain organized resistance without the leadership structure that had sustained them through months of fighting. But for Sarah, the successful completion of the mission represented something more than tactical victory. She had proven herself capable of performing under the most extreme conditions imaginable, making shots that tested the limits of both equipment and human capability. The young woman who had been doubted by her instructors at Fort Bragg had become one of the most effective military snipers in American history. The silence was the strangest part. After 6 months of constant gunfire, mortar attacks, and the tension that came with being under siege, the quietness that settled over the mountain ridge felt almost unnatural. Sarah sat in her hide sight, scanning the valley below through her scope, but for the first time in half a year there were no targets to engage. The insurgent withdrawal had been swift and complete. Within 48 hours of the leadership raid, organized resistance in the sector had collapsed entirely. Small groups of fighters remained in the area, but they were focused on escape rather than continuing the fight against American forces who had proven their superiority through months of combat. Intelligence reports confirmed what Sarah could observe through her scope. The insurgent network that had sustained the siege for 6 months had been effectively destroyed. The elimination of key leadership personnel, combined with the psychological impact of extreme-range precision fire, had broken the enemy's will to continue fighting. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez approached Sarah's position carrying a field telephone and wearing an expression she had rarely seen on his face, genuine relaxation. After months of constant vigilance, the absence of immediate threat was allowing soldiers throughout the unit to experience something approaching normal military routine. "Chen Battalion wants to talk to you," he said, offering her the handset. "Sounds like some pretty important people have been hearing about your shooting." Sarah accepted the phone with curiosity. During the siege, communication with higher headquarters had been limited to tactical reports and urgent requests for support. The idea that anyone beyond the immediate chain of command was aware of her individual performance was surprising. "Sergeant Chen, this is Colonel Williams at Division Headquarters," came the voice through the static-filled connection. "I've been reading the after-action reports from your recent operations, and I wanted to personally congratulate you on some outstanding marksmanship." Sarah wasn't sure how to respond. Military protocol demanded a respectful reply, but she had never received personal attention from officers at the division level. "Thank you, sir. I was just doing my job." "Sergeant, what you accomplished during that leadership raid goes far beyond normal duties. A 2,800-yard engagement under combat conditions is remarkable by any standard. The intelligence community is very interested in debriefing you about your techniques and equipment modifications. The conversation continued for several minutes, with Colonel Williams explaining that Sarah's performance had attracted attention at the highest levels of military leadership. Her extreme-range shooting had set new standards for what was considered possible in precision rifle operations, and various agencies wanted to study her methods for application in future operations. But what interested Sarah more than the recognition was the colonel's description of the strategic impact her actions had achieved. The elimination of insurgent leadership had disrupted enemy networks across multiple provinces, leading to a significant reduction in attacks against American forces throughout the region. What had begun as a tactical mission had produced strategic results that would save countless lives. After the phone conversation ended, Sarah found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this mountain ridge in Afghanistan. 2 years earlier, she had been a doubtful recruit struggling to prove herself in sniper training. Now she was being recognized as one of the most effective precision shooters in American military history. But the recognition felt less important than the personal growth she had experienced during the siege. The constant pressure, the life-or-death decisions, and the need to perform flawlessly under extreme conditions had revealed capabilities she had never known she possessed. More importantly, it had taught her lessons about herself that would influence everything she did for the rest of her life. Captain Morrison visited her position that evening to discuss the unit's upcoming redeployment. With the siege effectively ended and insurgent resistance in the sector neutralized, higher headquarters had decided to rotate the unit back to the United States for rest, refit, and training for future deployments. "You've got some decisions to make, Chen," Morrison told her as they watched the sun set over the now quiet valley. "There are people who want to recruit you for some very specialized units. Special operations, intelligence community, some programs I'm not even cleared to know about." Sarah listened as Morrison described the various opportunities that her performance had created. Elite units that normally recruited only from within their own ranks were expressing interest in her capabilities. Intelligence agencies were offering positions that would utilize her precision shooting skills in ways that went far beyond traditional military operations. "What do you think I should do, sir?" Sarah asked. Morrison was quiet for a long moment, studying the terrain where they had fought for 6 months. "That depends on what you want to accomplish, Sergeant. You've proven you can shoot better than almost anyone in the military. The question is what you want to do with that ability." The conversation forced Sarah to think about her future in ways she had avoided during the intensity of combat operations. For months, her focus had been entirely on the immediate mission, on surviving each day and performing her duties to the best of her ability. Now she needed to consider what came next. Over the following days, as the unit prepared for redeployment, Sarah found herself having similar conversations with other soldiers who had performed exceptionally during the siege. The 6 months of combat had identified natural leaders, innovative thinkers, and individuals with specialized skills that the military was eager to develop further. But she also noticed something else about her fellow soldiers. The experience of prolonged combat had changed everyone in subtle but fundamental ways. Soldiers who had begun the deployment as inexperienced troops were now veterans with hard-won knowledge about themselves and their capabilities. The siege had been a proving ground that had tested everyone's limits and revealed their true character. Sarah realized that her own transformation had been part of a larger process. The doubts that had plagued her early military career hadn't been overcome through individual effort alone. They had been eliminated through the shared experience of soldiers who had depended on each other for survival under the most challenging conditions imaginable. The recognition of her marksmanship skills was gratifying, but more important was the knowledge that she had contributed to the success of a team that had accomplished something remarkable. A small unit of American soldiers had held strategic ground against overwhelming odds for 6 months, ultimately achieving a decisive victory through superior training, equipment, and leadership. As the helicopters arrived to extract the unit from their mountain stronghold, Sarah took one final look through her rifle scope at the valley below. The insurgent positions that had threatened American forces for months were empty now, abandoned to the wind, and whether that would gradually reclaim them. She thought about the insurgent sniper she had eliminated during the early stages of the siege, and about the fighters she had engaged at extreme range during the leadership raid. Each engagement had been a test of skill, training, and mental toughness that had pushed her to perform at levels she had never thought possible. But she also thought about the American soldiers who had been saved by her precision fire, about the attacks that had been disrupted by the elimination of key enemy personnel, and about the intelligence that had been gathered through operations she had supported. Her individual achievements had meaning only within the context of the larger mission they had served. The flight back to the main operating base took 2 hours, carrying the unit away from the mountains that had been their home for 6 months. As Sarah watched the rugged terrain fall away below the helicopter, she realized that Afghanistan had given her something more valuable than recognition or career opportunities. It had given her absolute confidence in her ability to perform under pressure, to make critical decisions when lives depended on the outcome, and to maintain her focus when everything around her was chaos and uncertainty. These were qualities that would serve her well regardless of what path her career ultimately took. The debriefing process took several days, as intelligence analysts and military leadership sought to understand exactly what had happened during the siege and how the lessons learned could be applied to future operations. Sarah found herself describing her shooting techniques, equipment modifications, and tactical decisions to audiences that included some of the most senior officers in the American military. But the questions that interested her most came from younger soldiers who were preparing for their own deployments to Afghanistan and other combat zones. They wanted to know not just about the technical aspects of extreme-range shooting, but about the mental preparation and personal development that had enabled her to perform effectively under such challenging conditions. "How did you know you could make those shots?" asked a young corporal who was scheduled to attend sniper training after completing his current assignment. Sarah thought about the question carefully before responding. "I didn't know," she said finally. "But I had confidence in my training, my equipment, and my preparation. When you've done everything possible to prepare for a mission, you have to trust that training when the moment comes." The answer seemed to satisfy the young soldier, but Sarah realized it was incomplete. What she had discovered during the siege was that her capabilities extended far beyond what she had believed possible. The extreme-range shots that had seemed impossible during training had become routine under combat conditions, not because the technical challenges had diminished, but because the pressure had revealed reserves of skill and determination she had never accessed before. 3 weeks after leaving the mountain ridge, Sarah received orders assigning her to a specialized training unit where she would help develop new techniques for extreme-range precision shooting. The assignment would allow her to share the knowledge she had gained during the siege while continuing to refine her own capabilities. But more importantly, it would give her the opportunity to train the next generation of military snipers, passing on not just technical skills, but the mental discipline and personal confidence that had enabled her to excel under the most challenging conditions imaginable. As she prepared for her new assignment, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her from the doubts of basic training to recognition as one of the most effective precision shooters in American military history. The path had been difficult, demanding everything she had to give and more than she had thought she possessed. But it had also been the most rewarding experience of her life, teaching her lessons about herself and her capabilities that would influence everything she did in the years ahead. The young woman who had been dismissed by some as too small and too soft for military service had proven that determination, training, and mental toughness could overcome any physical limitations. The siege was over, but the lessons it had taught would last a lifetime. Sarah had discovered who she really was when everything else was stripped away, and that knowledge would guide her through whatever challenges the future might hold. The mountains of Afghanistan had been her proving ground, and she had emerged from that test with absolute confidence in her ability to meet any challenge with skill, courage, and unwavering determination.